Hey everybody, welcome to Dreamseed VR. I'm your host Seraphin, and today we're going to talk about two of my very most favorite things in life. We're going to talk about psychedelic art and cats, and the life of Louis Wain, the psychedelic cat Mang. So Louis Wain was a British illustrator that lived at the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century. He was born in 1860 and he passed away in 1939. And he was a prolific artist who created a huge catalog of these incredible anthropomorphic cats. And he also, later in his life, expressed these really interesting portraits of cats that incorporated psychedelic elements and fractals that have been so, I'm speechless, they've been so ahead of their time that it's only been in the 1960s and up until recently that people have truly started to appreciate the nature of his later work. During his time, Louis was fairly well appreciated. He was considered like a minor celebrity. He was the president of the National Cat Society, and he was regarded as an expert in cats. He had a really interesting but sad life. He was the only male born in a family of entirely females. And when he was in his early 20s, his father passed away, leaving him to be the sole breadwinner for a family of women. And unfortunately, mental illness ran in his family. And so none of his sisters ever wed, and the responsibility for their well-being was pretty much placed on him. And even though he was brilliant and incredibly prolific with his work, he was taken advantage of quite often in business. That he didn't copyright a great number of his works, and so those were taken advantage of throughout the course of his lifetime. But he was completely prolific. This guy put out somewhere near 600 illustrations and designs a year for many years at one point in his career. And he is responsible for changing the modern West's mentality of house cats from just mousers and more like work animals, to prevent pests and that sort of thing, and elevating them to like more of an emotional connection where people related to them on an empathic level and treated them more like the companions that we know of today. So in this way, Louis was so deeply ahead of his time. I'm going to get emotional because it's just so adorable and precious. This guy changed our modern perception of cats. And you could easily say that he's the progenitor and the dude responsible for, planting the seeds for the internet's appreciation of cats. And what's also really cool about his life and his imagination is that he was working in a time where electricity was becoming a element that was used in science and industry and transformed daily life. And he was super fascinated with it. And he had an amazingly intuitive understanding of the implications of electricity. And he also saw that we are electric beings and that there are amazing forces of physics within our biology that at the time weren't easily explained and weren't a part of science from the way we understand now with bioelectrics and biomagnetism and things like that. But his intuitive understanding of that was super ahead of its time. Unfortunately, because of the mental illness in his family and the instability of his personal life as a result of his eccentricities, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia later in his life. This diagnosis is often disputed by various people, and there's also an understanding that he may have just been on the autistic spectrum and been unique and neurodivergent in that way. But considering that clinically it's recognized that most schizophrenics have a decline in their motor skills with illustration, drawing, writing, that sort of thing, that it's probably unlikely that that was the case for Louis, because he was able to illustrate and draw throughout the course of his life and even into his mental decline later in life when he was admitted to a sanatorium. So Louis just was so interesting and so weird. I honestly didn't really know that much about his life on personal level until recently. And the reason I was inspired to create this video is because Amazon Studios recently made a biography of his life starring Benedict Cumberbatch. And it was really good, you guys. Like, I'm not going to lie, I saw it when I was really high, but it was amazing. It was charming and moving emotionally. It was super inspiring. It was kind of a cautionary tale about artists being taken advantage of by business and other people, which I felt like was really important to myself as an artist, but other people in creative industries as well. And I was just so impressed with their ability to bring honor and dignity to a guy's life that even though he was well recognized in the chorus of his life, he struggled a lot. He wed in his early 20s to a woman who was about 10 years or so his senior. And unfortunately, she passed away of breast cancer fairly early on in their relationship and their marriage. And he had such a deep, loving connection with her, and they really understood one another on a level that is super beautiful and rare in life. And throughout the course of the end of her illness, they had a pet cat named Peter. And Wain began drawing these super charming, emotive portraits of Peter. And I believe her name was Emily. She encouraged him to get them published. And even though, unfortunately, she didn't live long enough to see them published, cats became the center of his subject matter for the rest of his life. And I'm going to get totally bitch-missed to you guys. She encouraged him to share his gift because it brought happiness to people in a really wholesome and real way. It's so cute. It's so fucking cute. And I'm a cat lady, you guys. Look at me. I'm a fucking cat lady. And cats are so intelligent and beautiful and cool. And his illustrations really capture their charm and their intelligence and that they're like us, Like, a lot of times people don't understand the depth of animal intelligence. And granted, human beings are incredible. We're tool users, we're artists, we're scientists, and all of these amazing things. Like, the animal kingdom has a deep intelligence built not only into the minds of individual organisms, but as a whole, there's this really cool intelligence in nature. And I feel like he had a unique window into that. And his art did a really good job of acting as a vehicle for him to communicate that. So I want to talk about some cool scientific concepts that I personally believe he had a sensibility and intuitive understanding of, even though at the time, people attributed it as mostly to him just being a really eccentric dude, right? So in watching this cool movie, I couldn't help but notice that there were a lot of similarities in his understanding of what he called electricity with a realm of math and biology that is called harmonic resonance theory. So to give you a little bit of understanding of what I mean by harmonic resonance patterns, these are the standing wave patterns that you would see in the patterns and coloration of animals. So for example, you would see it in the spots of a leopard. You would also see it in the stripes on a cat or the scales on an animal. Or a fish, for example. So one of the more compelling features of harmonic resonance representation is that the same mechanism that defines those static patterns of standing waves are also capable of generating complex dynamic patterns of the sort that are most likely responsible for the sinusoidal oscillations. For example, like I said before, in fish or scales, and the periodic cyclic pattern of motion in, for example, centipede feet, right? In physics, resonance means a condition in which an oscillating system shows the maximum amplitude response to an alternating driving force. Now, this also relates to fractal geometry. And most of us in the psychedelic realm are already familiar with what we mean by fractals, but for those of us who aren't, I want to just like put a little side note on that so we're all on the same page. In mathematics, a fractal is a subset of Euclidean space with a fractal dimension that strictly exceeds its topological dimension. Fractals appear the same at different scales as illustrated in the Mandelbrot set. Fractals exhibit similar patterns at various scales, a property known as self-similarity. So in nature, you would see fractals as the branching of a tree. You would also see it in like the cracks on the sidewalk or glass. You would see it in the veins of the cardiovascular system. You would see it in the vein-like structures in the wing of a dragonfly. So fractal geometry definitely relates to all these things. And there's this amazing dovetailing of all these different mathematical fields within this subject. And I felt like it was important to kind of lay a little bit of groundwork. So another cool phenomenon that also dovetails into this is what are called Chilindi patterns. So I'll tell you a little bit about the guy who's the progenitor of the Chilindi patterns, and then I'll show you a couple examples of Chilindi patterns. So Ernst Florenz Friedrich Chilindi, whatever. He's born in November 30th, 1756 in Germany, and he lived until 1827. He's a German physicist and musician, and his most popular work, for which he's sometimes labeled as the father of acoustics, included research on vibrating plates and the calculation of the speed and the sound of different gases. So this guy would essentially take something like sand or flour, some kind of particulate matter, and put it on a plate called a Chilindi plate, and with the bow of a violin or something similar would vibrate the plate at different frequencies, and that particulate matter would separate on the plate in these amazing acoustic patterns, which I'll also demonstrate. Now, one of these plates in particular is very interesting because it has the shape of a turtle shell, right? And so it's showing you the bioacoustic properties of like those waveform oscillations, and that relates to the biomorphic resonance that we talked about earlier. So this field of mathematics and understanding acoustic vibrations is the same as this other one in a lot of ways. So another interesting thing about the Chilindi figures is that they're known to be related to the solutions of the Schrödinger equation for one-electron atoms, and the mathematics describing them was used by Erwin Schrödinger to arrive at an understanding of electron orbitals. So for those of you who are science nerds, you know that there's another famous theoretical cat in the history of science, Schrödinger's cat. My cousin. All right, so another node within this larger picture of how these various science experiments and understandings of mathematics dovetail into this is the work of Alan Turing. Now, for those of you who know, Alan Turing was a cryptographer and a mathematician who was brilliant and very troubled as a result of his persecution for being gay. And he committed suicide, which was super sad. It was just before his 42nd birthday. But he was a brilliant guy, and he wrote this amazing groundbreaking paper called The Chemical Basis of Morphogenesis in 1952. It was his last work. And it was essentially the paper that attempted to describe the mathematical reasoning for why a leopard's spots are the way they are, the way they disperse on the body. It was an elegant mathematical schema for the formulation of the patterns found in animals and plants. Far from random, he argued, they were the result of interacting chemicals that spread among groups of otherwise identical cells. He coined the term morphogen, and I believe this is related to why we call it morphogenic resonance now. He was sort of deliberately vague about what the morphogens were. They could be hormones or perhaps genes, and the chemical nature of which in the 1950s was still being figured out. The main idea was that they would diffuse and react to one another. They now call that the reaction diffusion process. His theory that he laid out in math was that within those tissues and cells that there would be two morphogens that would act on one another and create like this push-pull action. This is the same kind of push-pull action that you would see in things like the varied colors on a sand dune, perhaps, when the wind sweeps it and you notice that like the different grains of color and texture of the sand separate in these like cool fractal veins. I recently visited Florence, which is the place where Frank Herbert was inspired by the dunes to write his novel Dune. And I actually got to witness those same patterns in dunes that I'm describing, like with these mathematic processes. And I got some sand and brought it home. It's on my special altar of nerdiness. So at the most basic level, these patterns emerge from seemingly randomness as varying concentrations of color activated and color inhibiting chemicals. This would create dark spots to form, and in return the spots to emerge into stripes and other color activating tissues that become more concentrated. And this part is particularly interesting because in the Amazon Studios biopic of Louis Wain, there's an interesting part where he's having a conversation at a cat show after he was nominated and crowned the president of the Cat Society. And he's describing to somebody his theory for why cats have stripes. And back in the day, like with his cute, crazy eccentricity, he hypothesized that it was because at some point in the cat's ancestry that it had been struck by lightning and that these patterns were electrical, right? But what I find really interesting is that even though that is not true in a direct scientific sense, his understanding of that it's frequency related and that it has to do with this sort of like fractal geometry differentials is intuitively accurate on some level. And I find that really interesting because even though this guy was considered crazy and eccentric and weird, his observational perceptions of the world did have a unique perspective that is not common in society or psychology. And I was really moved by that, and I thought it was super interesting. And I also was captivated by the fact that so many of these things regarding harmonic resonance pattern and fractals are the bedrock of the visionary art movement in psychedelia. Whether it's fractal geometry or our understanding of jaguar and leopard spots from South American cultures, or even things like Shipibo weave patterns, which are direct representations of harmonic resonance from the Icaro songs that the ayahuasqueros sing. So all of these seemingly disparate concepts and ideas from art and science and biology have this really cool coming together, this fusing of elements in this multi-dimensional understanding of nature, which I was just like, chef's kiss, super cool. And I wanted to describe it. So for those of you who want to get really nerdy, right, that's Chilindi patterns. That is Alan Turing and his morphogens stuff. And then that's fractal geometry, including the work of Mandelbrot. So have at it with those cool bits. And yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and just sort of keep it as brief as I can. I know it was dense, but please do check out the work of Louis Wain. The guy was incredibly charming. That's the word that comes to mind. It's so wholesome and so adorable. It's not extremely cyberpunk this time, but I can't help but reiterate the understanding that in his time, electricity was brand new. And in that way, he was a futurist and he was ahead of his time. And even though it's not cyberpunk, it's almost like ray punk or steampunk. I personally think that Louis Wain was a futurist, and I think his story is really fascinating, and it's a merit to the lasting quality of his work that it had so much inspiration on the psychedelic movement in the 60s, and in particular the artwork of the Grateful Dead and many other artists. And his fractals are just so detailed and incredible, and they draw upon so many cultural works in like jacquard fabrics and arabesque mosaics and the tile work and Islamic geometry. Another cool factoid that you'll notice if you do happen to watch the movie is that he was able to illustrate with both hands at the same time in a symmetrical form, which I find just so cool. And it's pretty common for unique neurodivergents to have novel ways of interacting with their stylists and their mediums. So there's so many varieties of even human consciousness and perception. And even though he was not a guy who like took psychedelics, I think that the consciousness in and of itself is psychedelic. And this is a really compelling part of modern history that speaks to that in a way that just has so much merit. Definitely check out his work. His cute little anthropomorphic cats are a staple of children's storybook style, and his later works are gorgeous. So enjoy some Louis Wain. Thank you so much for going on this random tangent with me. As soon as I saw the film, I knew I wanted to cover it. He has felt like to me to be this gem tucked away in off the beaten path of psychedelia, right? And to see him get covered in a really dignified biopic with some really talented actors bringing his story to life and sharing it with a modern audience, I think is like such a long time coming event. And I feel like so much pride as someone who has like benefited so much from his work, just, having cat friends in my life. Like, I can't imagine a society without Louis Wain, because then so many millions of people might not have had cats the same way that we do now. And we wouldn't have all the cute cats on Instagram that give us like dopamine hits when we're sad and we need a little pick-me-up. You just look at some cute kitten's face. And that was not a staple of Western society before Louis popularized the house cat. So thank you, Louis. Thank you, Peter the cat. Thank you, his lovely wife, Emily, who believed in him and loved his work. And thank you, viewer, for tolerating me being a bitch misty cat over here. And if you like my silliness, please check out my Patreon at patreon.com/Seraphin. And you can also check out, the website is dreamseedvr.com. You can find me on social. It's dreamseed_VR on Instagram. And stay tuned. I still have our Reading Rainbow style reading of H.R. Giger's Biomechanics coming up soon, as well as a plethora of really amazing interview guests I've been lining up for the end of this year and into the beginning of next year. So again, thank you. Have fun. Be good to one another. And if you have a cat, go pet it. I love you guys. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.